telling. Oh, sorry, we're being recorded now. It's not that we're not telling the person about the risks that are involved with what they're doing, but we are really letting them make their own informed choices about where they go with things, because there's higher levels of motivation from someone if they're coming into the room and having that approach, as opposed to the big, this is doing you harm, say no to drugs. But that's hard for a parent to understand who's really worried about their young person. So yeah, when a parent reaches out, we want to be able to offer them a response as well as the young person. Yeah.
Thank you. For me, I think we've developed a much more family inclusive process, but I think navigating the system is really quite difficult. Do you think having, access to the state-based system at a street-based level where people can walk in as opposed to being directed to a phone number will make a difference with the new setting on Moorabool Street?
I hope so. I really, really hope so. But all I can say is I hope, because who knows what that will look like in operations. I don't know whether there'll be capacity for a huge amount of walk-ins to that setting, or whether the intake system will sit in the building. So the design is going to be super, super important. But a personal view, if someone has the courage and strength to walk in a door at a service, we need to offer them an immediate intervention. And if that's supporting them to ring through the centralised intake process while they're with you, that would be what we'd do. But we can be quite creative in the way we work around the systems, and we do have scope to do walk-ins, immediate assessments, and take people on if that's the effort they've made to get to that front door. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Malcolm?
It does. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just reading messages. Thank you, Penny, for sharing that link. Gary, do you want to ask your question?
It was just in regards to that last bit we were talking about with parents and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is it also, like, it's because there's a chance of scaring them off, like from support services, if you're there telling them you've got to give up, you shouldn't be doing it, rather than going about it the way you do.
Do you want to take that?
Did that make sense? Like, they're more likely to not come back if they're feeling pressured into giving up and stuff. So is that generally why you take that approach as well?
It's about ownership. So as I mentioned just before, this is a change process. So we're not, I always say to people, we don't work in drug and alcohol, we work in change. And that just happens to be in the context of drug and alcohol treatment. Our core purpose is to facilitate an environment and a process where someone feels empowered to change the position in life that they're not happy with, right? So in order to do that, it has to come with ownership. Right? So if I said to you, Gary, as an example, stop drinking coffee, right? That doesn't mean much, because you'll stop if you want to, or you'll stop if, or you'll keep going if you don't want to. But if I come alongside you, educate you on the harms, on the benefits of not doing this, on the information around the issue, and encourage you to make up your own mind, well, now it's your decision to change. It's not my decision for you to change. And that's when you see really significant progress and growth for a person, because it's theirs, right? And it's, for me, it's a fundamental issue of, I don't have the authority to tell you what to change, right? Because it's your life, it's not my life. The moment we start doing that, well, free choice is now absent, right? So it's really about educating someone, which is that harm minimization, harm reduction space, but empowering them. And that's why we take a client-centered approach. It's about empowering a person to feel that they can make the changes that they want to make. It becomes a little bit challenging, right? Because we all hold our own values. And I know quite often with staff, it comes up in clinical supervision where a client's values are their values, my values are my values, and those values might not be the same, and they might not align. So I can sit here and place judgment upon any of you based upon my values, right? But me to share that in the context of AOD treatment and change is just going to create a divide between us and put up barriers. There's no benefit to that.
Is it hard to get the parents to understand that? Like when it's
I
their
love
kids? Yeah.
I love the opportunity to speak to parents because what a beautiful space to educate, right? And that's all it is, right? We've touched on trauma. Well, how traumatic for parents to watch their child destroy their lives through drug use, right? So it's the same approach, whether you're working with a family member, a significant other, a partner, or the individual who's in that addiction, is it's around empowerment.
Yep.
And it's around education. Most people get really fired up and really passionate and really distraught when they don't quite understand what's happening or why it's happening. So, we see a big part of our role is to de-escalate situations, is to normalize situations so that we can take a breath, right, get some space and start to have an educational conversation that is rooted in kind of productive action. What can you do that's going to benefit? And how do you do that in a way that's going to lead to a positive outcome and a positive environment for change to occur? Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Well, that question from Kate, there's the next hour gone.
That's it.
You're right.
Straight up stigma attached to drug and alcohol use. It's still really live, and what you read within the articles that were presented around methamphetamine does not support people seeking help when language is used like heroin heads and pot heads, and can't even remember what else was in that article at this point, but there is still a real stigma attached to a drug and alcohol problem. And there's stereotypes that are in community that people kind of attach to, including people who use drugs. They'll often use some of that derogatory language themselves, but it's kind of that community vibe around it is still a little bit difficult when it comes to people seeking help. So that's one, I guess, and Jackson's maybe got a little bit more to say about that stigma piece, but sometimes our systems and our funding actually are barriers for people accessing AOD support. And we've referenced a couple of times the centralised intake space that we have in our region. That's not often the most welcoming kind of entry point into service. So I guess that's a big part of our jobs, is actually trying to make the systems work behind the scenes so people actually don't experience barriers for accessing AOD support. People living in smaller communities don't have access to services in their own areas. So we try really hard as a partnership to locate services in communities, so it makes it easier for people to get to them. So, we have a program that has drug and alcohol counsellors sitting within GP clinics that actually allows them to be allows a person to come to the doctors. They could be going to a podiatrist, they could be going to anything. There's not this big drug and alcohol service sign at the door of a GP clinic. So it's about getting into community spaces to encourage people to seek support and help in their own communities. Telehealth has been amazing for that. Not ideal because you haven't got the person in the room with you, but we are able to, we've been quite surprised at the success we've had with people being quite comfortable with that telehealth space. So they're the two things that stand out for me. We're often a really crappy funded service system that we're trying to make the best of that front entry point and not make the person and the family do all the work. But that's a struggle when you're funded in a competitive way sometimes with other services and consortiums. But yeah, that's probably my two offerings around that. And I will, while I've got the talking stick, just flag, I have to leave about 12:30 today. Apologies, I have to prioritise another meeting. So Jackson will stay with, but I'll depart. All right.
The only thing I'd add is the other kind of end of the end of the spectrum, which is the person themselves, right? And you've got things like pride. I think pride often gets in the way for people reaching out and accessing support. Shame and guilt is massive. It's probably the biggest one, where Josie mentioned it earlier around the courage and the resilience it takes to reach out and say, I need some help, right? More often than not, we're all a bit reluctant to do that. And in doing that, you're admitting that you've got a problem, and we don't like to admit we have problems very often. So I think that plays a big part. So whilst there's the systematic challenges and issues, there's also the fundamental human challenges and issues with admitting that you need support. There's still stigma around counselling, not just in an AOD context, but in general. The word therapy often makes people feel uncomfortable. So there's all these kind of things that happen internally for a person that prevent them from reaching out or admitting that they need that support or owning that. And a big part of that is education, right? And it's breaking down that stigma, because we put a lot of emphasis, and we've spoken a lot in these sessions around community-based stigma, but community-based stigma is the result of individual views and stigma, right? And it's just a collective noun for the views that we all hold. So if the majority of the community has a stigma around certain things, well, that's because the majority of people who are voicing that hold those views themselves personally. So that's a big piece, and that happens through conversation. So we can get up there on our soapboxes and do what some others do and write articles in the Geelong Advertiser that no one really wants to read anyway. Or we can have organic conversation, and we can talk to our mates, we can talk to those people that we come into contact with within our lives, and open those conversations and start to destigmatize that way. And I think that is where true change comes in that context. And if done, then people feel more open and more educated on how to access support and when and where they need to go and why they need to go and all those sorts of things. So there's a lot of good initiatives happening. There's organisations in particular that focus on sporting clubs, and they go in there and do very much educational pieces around things and kind of stigma breaking exercises. But of course, we're in the world now of early preventative measures, and we know that early prevention is the #1 key. So the more we do that, the better. But the more that happens, not under the umbrella of service provision or an organisation, but through people now like yourselves who are getting this really clear understanding, just having those conversations and getting on your soapbox in your personal life, I think is a really important thing.
Very much. Thanks, Jackson. Kate's got a follow-up question, and then we'll get to Joan, who's put a question up in the chat. So Kate wants to know, for both you and Jackson and Josie, what are the limitations of someone accessing Bowen Health for AOD, for example? And I'm going to steer that question partly in terms of the state-funded access point, and I had personal experience of how problematic that rollout was of that centralised intake at a state service level, but also this be interesting to think about what services sit behind that entry point within Bowen Health as well.
So I think I don't want to, how do I put it? I'll be really upfront. I don't want to bag out Bowen Health, because they play a really, really critical role in the whole drug and alcohol setting. And the intent is good behind their centralised intake. So when Bowen Health won the tender to play that centralised intake role, they really kind of leaned into that co-occurring. If you've got a mental health, drug and alcohol presentation, it's important to assess for both, regardless of what you're coming in the door with as your presenting issue. So what they did was combined their mental health triage point with the drug and alcohol triage point, with the intent behind it to get a really good brief screening and assessment of risk behind the AOD and mental health presenting issue. What it did create, I guess, in reality is a bit of a block whereby, say if Jackson's got a drug and alcohol issue, he's picked up the phone, he gets to a centralised intake point where he has to press 1 if he's under 25, 2 if he's over 25. There's 6 options that I think you can go through. So often, because they're really under-resourced, you won't get through to a person straight away. You'll actually get a recording where you leave your number and someone can call you back. So that's difficult in itself because you're not actually talking to a person straight up. And it doesn't happen all the time, but I really just want to point that out as a difficulty, I think, in the access space, because I don't know, if I was that person, I'd want us to talk to somebody straight away if I could, that could get me to the right place. So that becomes a bit of a barrier. And if you've rang once and you're not getting the response you want, you're probably not going to ring back. You probably might start searching around for other supports, or you might go, oh, well, I'm just going to do this all myself and there's no point in actually accessing the service system. So I think resourcing is a bit of an issue at that primary entry point at Barwon Health. The joining of the two, if I'm a drug and alcohol person, if I'm coming in with a substance use issue, I might not want to go there with my mental health. So shut that area down. You know, I don't want to talk about that straight away. Recognising it is important, but we've got to work with what the person's bringing in to the room to start with. So they're 2 things that come up for me with the Barwon Health sort of setup. Jackson might want to kind of extend that. It's a difficult one to answer without being too critical, but Barwon Health brings in the medical model too, which is super, super important in the mix of working with somebody. But the thing we play to is in our strength is we don't have a medical based kind of model, in the sense of when you walk in the front door, that's not going to be the primary thing we're looking for. We're looking more for the social determinants of health. To be honest, Barwon Health is moving more towards that direction because the mental health reform piece has really pointed out that social determinants of health as being a big focus that's needed to kind of be brought in to that initial contact. So we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Kate? Does that give you what you were, wherever you are?
Yes, it sure does. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks, Kate. There's another question that Joan has put up around assessment tools specifically aimed at looking for, doing a drug and alcohol screen, but identifying trauma, PTSD specifically.
Yep.
Think of any assessment tools that are good at picking that up?
I'll answer that one and Gary's simultaneously. It's an interesting space because there's a lot of conversation around having, what's the word, clinicians that are mental health clinicians and AOD clinicians and family violence clinicians. So it's all becoming, there's a shift to it becoming quite blended, which has its benefits and challenges. The PTSD and trauma one, I think, is a really challenging space. When we talk about the context of an assessment, right, an assessment is to assess in AOD context, and we use the standardised turning point tools that are used across the public and usually the private sector in Victoria. And there's 3 elements to that. There's an intake tool, which is very much a gathering of information so that we can start the process. There's a self-completion tool, which looks at what has life been like currently and in the past 30 days. I think it is 30 days, 12 months. Anyway, a fraction of time. And then there's...
What was that called again? Sorry, Jackson.
The self-completion tool. And these are all available on the Turning Point website.
Yeah.
And then you've got the comprehensive assessment, which is about past, present, and future, basically. And within that, mental health's a big focus. So, the answer to your question there, Gary, is yes. In relation to trauma and PTSD, we rarely single that out. And we do that on purpose because once you start to delve into that space, it can be really challenging to contain. And it can, at that point in time, not be overly beneficial. Right? So we have a tendency to take very much a strength-based approach and a person-centered approach. And a lot of that is framed around forward thinking. Right? So every organisation will be different, every service will be different, but the way our clinicians tend to focus on that is it will naturally present and appear. And if it presents and appears in a very problematic way, then we refer. We have psychologists, we have psychiatrists, we have very strong psychiatric mental health support. And part of that is there are people who are dedicated at dealing with PTSD and trauma and grief and bereavement. Let's let them do that. Okay? So it's kind of, it does come up, but it comes up organically, and you'll know when that appears, right? We know it's there. There will be some sort of trauma, right? But it's around who's the most appropriate person to manage that, because it is different to mental health. It is a different area, and it's a more specialized area. So the kind of blanket rule that I tell my clinicians is we work with anything that's kind of directly relating to the AOD treatment. If it starts to branch out too far, then we need to refer on, right? For multiple reasons. We don't employ people to be, trauma-informed clinicians or trauma practicing clinicians, right? So it comes back to that piece around funding. We have to do what we're funded to do, and we need to let others do what they're funded to do, right? And we trust in the system that that's the best outcome for the client. So yes, it will come up, but I know when I was doing assessments, as soon as significant trauma came up, we park it and let's link you in with someone who's going to be able to walk you through that journey much better than I can.
Yeah. And if there's resistance from a person to kind of engage in some of those services, it's really important as a clinician that you get the right supports around you while you're holding that space. So, as I was listening to Jackson, it's really important if you're picking up on some of those more sort of trauma, PTSD behaviours and reactions, I guess it's important to reach out to the services that specialise in it to inform what you're doing with that person in the room with you, because you don't want to get into a position where you're completely out of your depth without the support to actually kind of get it to a different place. So we do have people who we know have got trauma, but they're not prepared to go and see that specialist support service, but they're prepared to still walk in our door. So how can we hold that space with them, try and motivate them to get to the point where they're okay to see the specialist, and really make sure that the worker is supported through supervision and the right consult points to be able to feel confident to hold that space. So I just think that's, because we're not always going to have someone going, cool, I'll go and see that specialist, but it's so important that you have that voice of that specialist service in there to guide what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Josie and Jackson. I think it's a complex area because some people want to address what's happening for them now in terms of their situational use, with an understanding that their addiction history has been triggered through unresolved trauma, often in, trauma upon trauma upon trauma, and we can look through that trauma-informed lens, but by the same token, if people need individual specialist therapy, that needs to be available as well. I'm just going to screen share the Turning Point website that has the tools that Jackson referred to. I know when we do the drug and alcohol unit in our course, I refer to these. They sit on the Department of Health website for Victoria, but also they're on the Turning Point website because they actually developed the tools, if I'm correct. And so they're available and downloadable. There's a clinician guide as well as the comprehensive assessment, the intake, self-completion, all the things that Jackson talked about there.
It's important to recognise trauma is a spectrum, right? So everyone has trauma. Everyone has experienced trauma, and everyone carries that trauma with them. All of us here do. Right? And it's about knowing when to delve into that trauma and when to not. And you know, we will all assess that differently. But for me, it's about impact today. Right? Is my trauma impacting me negatively today? If so, then I need to do something. If not, then it's just a part and it sits there, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be revisited, right? One of the biggest challenges that you can find yourself in when talking about trauma with someone is re-traumatization. Right? Sometimes revisiting trauma is traumatic. Right? So then it becomes a question of, it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? But you know, I always find that when I'm getting to that point, it's beyond my scope of treatment. It's beyond what I'm trained and comfortable in doing. So I'll bring an expert in. Right? But in the context of assessments, I would very rarely even ask a follow-up question, you know, if trauma presented, because it's not the space either, right? You think about the purpose of it, we're assessing. We're assessing a situation, we're assessing a person in the context of drug and alcohol treatment to make sure we get them where they need to go, whether that be counselling, case management, rehab, detox. That's the purpose of the assessment. It's not treatment in itself. That's what comes next. So we're just gathering information, and that's where your counselling skills come into it, to be able to, you know, recognise that it's there for a person, but to navigate them back on path to where we need to go. Right? So it would be very unlikely that, you know, any clinician would unpack trauma in an assessment.
Yeah. On that note, I'm going to have to run away, people, and leave you in Jackson's capable hands. So we'll be on next week again. Is that right?
We are, yes.
All right. So I'll lock that in. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks for having me.
No worries, thanks.
Thanks, Jason.
So my question in follow-up to that, Jackson, is really about, we know that in the drug and alcohol sector, we often talk about a treatment plan. And when we think of the T word, the treatment word, which is another terminology that we use perhaps more in AOD than we use in generalist youth work or use in across community services, when we're looking at developing a treatment plan, how would that differ from an individual recovery or a care coordination type plan?
There's two parts to treatment planning, and they all have different names, right, depending on who you work for. But there's kind of two elements to it. One is the element of the individual. So it's the plan that I create with Malcolm. We do that together, and I tend to work off, and I know a lot of my clinicians here, is SMART goals, right? Why overcomplicate something, right? Keep it simple, right? And we break it down into key areas of a person's life, because we're big on holistic response and holistic treatment. You cannot look at addiction as an isolated thing, right? It just doesn't work like that. So it's about looking at, you know, every area of a person's life with them, right? And starting to map out a treatment plan for that person, which is essentially a roadmap from point A to point B, and what changes they want to make, where they want to end up, and how they're going to navigate that, right? And that includes, you know, all the supports around them. So it includes, you know, it might be family members, friends, professional supports like other GPs, or, you know, a mental health clinician, or whatever it is, right? And we bring that together and we help that person navigate that process to achieve the life that they want to achieve. Then there's the other element of that, which, you know, at Odyssey we call the clinical review process, which is a very similar thing that happens without the client present, right? So what would happen is we would do an assessment. I'll pick someone random. Let's say Jonah came into Odyssey House to do an assessment, right? And then once that assessment is completed, the clinician who did that assessment with Jonah would bring that to a clinical review meeting And at that clinical review meeting is a bunch of other clinicians. We often at times have GPs present. We have an addiction medicine specialist from the St Vincent's Hospital who attends that as well. And the clinician who completed the assessment presents that assessment, and it's about pulling of the minds, right? We bring everyone together and we look at this person's situation, right? Very much from a risk perspective. So, you know, we look at what medications they're on, what their substance use is, how much are they using, how are they using, and we assign them a tier rating from 5 to 1. 5 being kind of very complex, very high risk, and 1 being least complex and least high risk. And then from there, we start to map out what are the potential treatment options, right? And then from there, we take that to the client and we go, okay, we're thinking this. So we, you know, what about the day program, or what about rehab? What do you want to do? What are your thoughts? And that's where we navigate that with the client to come up with an agreed treatment plan. So, you know, we talk about client-centered a lot and client choice, but, you know, it's not as simple as saying to the client or Jonah, in this case, what do you want to do, right? It's about a mutual agreement. And that's why it's treatment, right? Is it's about working through the options together, the benefits, the losses, and agreeing on a pathway. Okay. And that's where they're kind of the 2 elements, basically, Malcolm, if that answers your question.
Thank you. Yep, it does. I think for me, some of the care coordination work that we talk about youth workers and other community services engaging in is coordinating the services that wrap around the client, as well as the setting up the goals, making sure everybody that client's working with is aware of their broader goals to support their recovery at the end of the day. But I think sometimes we get lost when we start using the term treatment, because we initially think of, well, does that mean medicated withdrawal? Does that mean a residential rehabilitation stay as being more treatment orientated than home-based outreach or community-based support?
Exactly right. And there's a place for all of them. You know, we have on our staff here, we have non-residential withdrawal nurses who manage a reduction or a withdrawal for a person through the use of medication, right? And that's just as important as, you know, having an informal conversation with a client about what their plans are for tomorrow. Right? So again, it's a spectrum, and it's about having all of these tools at your kind of availability to provide the best one or the best combination for what that client needs. And that changes for every single client. It changes for some clients on a daily or on an hourly at times. So it's just about the provision of options, and through that we educate the client on this is what these different options are. This is our opinion on what we think would be best. What are your thoughts on that? What are you comfortable with? And then we go from there.
Yeah. So one of the questions that one of the students in the room put to me, Jackson, was what actually are the services that Odyssey provides in Geelong?
What are they? So we have a myriad of different services. All of our services here at Odyssey are non-residential. So Odyssey has 3 rehabs in other areas of Victoria, but just in Barwon we have counselling, which is pretty self-explanatory. We have care coordination or case management. We have a day program, which is a 4-day-a-week, 5-hour-a-day program where people come in and they build a community together. Then we have our non-residential withdrawal nurses. We have a family reunification program, which is working with a parent or parents who have lost custody of their child for a period of time that's usually 12 months under a child protection order. And we work with them to meet the requirements of that protection order to ultimately and hopefully regain custody of their child and children. And we have an overdose prevention program, which is very much the pointy end of the stick, where we work with clients who are very, very close to dying as a result of their substance use. So that usually involves very high risk behaviour and concurrent kind of high risk elements to their life. So, you know, more often than not, they'll be injecting drugs daily. And by the time they find themselves with us, you know, they're not just injecting in their arm, they're injecting in their eyelids, in between their toes, in their groin, areas like that. And they're not using clean equipment. They might also have, you know, a significant mental health challenge that they're working through. They might be homeless, or they might, you know, be relatively involved in criminal activity. And it's often concurrent substance use. So I can think of, you know, one that I was talking to a clinician about yesterday, who is smoking marijuana, taking 20 milligrams of Valium a day, drinking a litre of vodka a day straight, and then also uses heroin 3 or 4 times a week. That in itself is exceptionally dangerous, right? Because that's a lot of drug use. And they also have a dependent child. So they've got full-time custody of their son, right? And they're a single parent. So there's the complications and complexities around the care for this child, right? And they live with no family support. So they live on their own. They've got no family in the state, okay? And they've been doing this for quite a long time. So this client yesterday, 2 days ago, ended up hospitalised because they'd had a seizure as a result of not drinking for 2 days, right? Their body had become so used to it, which is called the DTs, or the delirium tremens, which is when your body basically starts to shut down because it's become so dependent on alcohol, and now you're not drinking. So this client is heavily engaged in our overdose prevention program, and there's a plan in place. And ironically, right, and this might sound a bit silly, but part of their plan is to keep drinking, right? Because at this point in time, it's more dangerous for that person not to drink alcohol than it is for them to continue drinking and then link in with a non-residential withdrawal nurse and do a slow reduction through the use of medication to compensate for that alcohol consumption. So that's kind of that's the very pointy end. And they're the programs that we offer. Yeah.
So Jackson, just following on from that, if you were considering medicated withdrawal, what are some of the typical substances that we offer medicated withdrawal from?
Yeah, really good question. The most common substance used for alcohol withdrawal is Valium, because it alleviates a lot of those physiological responses to alcohol leaving and being absent from the system. So alcohol is a really interesting one. It's the most dangerous substance to detox from, right? If your body's used to consuming copious amounts. So we would use Valium, and then Campril is another medication that's used more longer term. So Valium is a short-term medication, and should rarely be used for more than 30 days because it's so addictive. It's incredibly addictive. And then we would transition someone onto using Campril, which is very interesting medication, but a lot of people report that it actually turns them off the taste of alcohol as well, which can be helpful. But that is just more of a long-term medication management option. And that's pretty much it. They're the 2 most commonly used alcohol withdrawal medications. Yeah.
Okay. And apart from alcohol, are there any other substances that we would use medication for to support withdrawal?
Yeah, good question. Valium's always a go-to one, or benzodiazepines in general. Valium's a quick-acting benzo, and then you've got longer-acting ones. For heroin use or opiate use, which can be, using prescription medications as well. If you've got an opiate-based prescription medication, it's the same thing as abusing heroin, right? We would use opiate replacement therapy, which is methadone. I'm assuming most people have heard of methadone before. Methadone is a controlled dose of heroin, in essence, that you pick up from a chemist. And it's a little syrup that's mixed with like a heap of sugar, basically. So it's like drinking straight cordial. And that's used to control the heroin the effects that heroin was having on a person's body. So it's a controlled dose. The challenge with that, with methadone, is that it can be easily abused. So I know a lot of clients who have used methadone to reduce from heroin, but then just kept using heroin as well. And then the risk of overdose goes up, right? So what they use now, more often than not, methadone's kind of being phased out more and more, is something called Suboxone. And Suboxone is, again, it's got a component that's very similar to heroin, but it's a synthetically made version. But it also contains Narcan or naloxone, which is a blocker. So basically what it means is if you use Suboxone, you can't then use heroin and get an even higher, even higher. So it's a bit safer for people that are on opiate replacement therapy. And then the other commonly used substance or medication that's used is for methamphetamine use and cocaine use, which is quetiapine or Seroquel. And Seroquel is it's a very intense prescription medication, and it comes in both short-acting and extended release forms. And it is, in essence, it falls under the category of an antipsychotic medication. But that doesn't mean that someone has to be in psychosis for it to be prescribed. The reason it's used for ice withdrawal is it calms every aspect of your body, so to speak, both kind of inside your brain, but also your body itself. So what it does is it helps with things like insomnia, which is very common for people who have stopped using ice. So insomnia, it has similar effects to Valium. So it's got that anxiety relieving element to it. But it also helps with kind of overthinking and overstimulated thought patterns, which are very common for someone who's coming off ice. So they would be the most commonly prescribed medications for those areas of drug use. But Valium tends to be if in doubt, a doctor will prescribe you Valium, which in theory is okay if it's used properly, but it's easily abused and extremely addictive and hard to withdraw from.
Yeah, and often with Valium, I've seen clients build up a tolerance, and so their use of Valium goes up exponentially, and we've replaced or added another addiction to the list. So that can be problematic. Yeah,
exactly right. Happens all the time. We treat a lot of people for Valium addiction, which they get from their GP, ironically.
Exactly. So there's a follow-up from Kate and Penny just asking about the case you talked about, Jackson, with the parents with substance use issues. Child protection for and foremost in our mind as drug and alcohol workers, we have to abide by the Victorian Child Safe legislation. How do we manage that situation, particularly where we see a person, polysubstance using, we know that there's a child present. How do we go about finding out if child protection are aware of the issues, and how do we manage that?
Yes, this exact conversation came up yesterday about the example I gave. And it's always an interesting one because it is equally a very prescriptive area as well as a very grey area, right? So if you look at kind of the requirements and the guidelines, you go, well, that's easy. That makes sense, right? I know what I need to report and what I don't. Until you're in the position where you potentially making a call that will result in someone having their child taken away from them. And all of a sudden you start to doubt what you're reading. You start to question it because it's a very serious thing, right? The biggest one is mandatory reporting, which applies across the board, right? And in the context of a child, it's even more prescriptive where me as a manager of a program at an organisation, if I had a clinician that didn't report something that should have been reported, both I and the clinician can go to jail, right, if proven negligent, right? So you've also got that sitting in the back of your mind going, well, if I don't do anything, am I going to end up in jail, right? So it becomes this really hard space to navigate. In Victoria, we have a different piece of legislation as well, which is different to other states, which is the Child Information Sharing Scheme, which is all around interagency reporting for the safety of a child, which alleviates some of what used to be out of scope of mandatory reporting. So we now are able to communicate more effectively and more quickly without worrying about consent as much between organisations when we're talking about risk to a child, okay? But the biggest thing is determining at what point does the risk become reportable, right? So I can say to you mandatory reporting, right, is if I believe that you're at risk of harming yourself and or someone else, right? Sounds simple, right? But there's always complexities. There's always context and there's always reasons why and why not, right? So it becomes a question of judgment. And this is where a clinician would never make that judgment on their own, but in consultation with their team leader, their coordinator, or myself. And we unpack the scenario, right? So is there risk-taking behaviour? Is there immediate harm? Right? Have we witnessed anything? So in this example I was talking about, I had 2 workers go to the house and you've got a small child there and dirty needles well within reach of that child. Well, there's a risk, right? The next question that I would ask would be, how's the child getting to school, right? They're a school-age child. You're telling me you drink a litre of vodka kind of starting at lunchtime into the evening. Are you driving that child to school? If so, there's another risk, right? Because you're driving intoxicated. And if someone is driving intoxicated with a child in the car, then I will report that, right? Without question, right? And then it's looking at a whole bunch of other risk factors. And an organisation will have their risk matrix that you work through to determine the severity of risks, which is a really good way to do it. But it's a judgment call, right? And it's a very simple philosophy of, if in doubt, right, report it. Right? If you've got reasonable belief, right, there's risk to this child, because I would rather do that and cop a nasty phone call from a parent, right, than a child end up dead. Okay. So once you've determined that there's a risk, then you make that call to the appropriate service. Sometimes it's the police, sometimes it's child protection, sometimes it's somewhere like the Orange Door, right? And if in doubt, you can call places for secondary consult. So we have services that we know we can call. I've got contacts in child protection that I'll run the scenario by them. They're identified, of course, and go, what do you think? What should I do? Right, so it's about sharing risk, which is really important. We don't report every drug user to child protection, okay, as we don't report every drug user to the police, right? Theoretically, every client I've ever worked with is engaged in criminal activity, right? But I'm not going to report that. Let the cops do their job, right? That's why they get paid more than me. So we wouldn't report to child protection unless there was a severe and or immediate risk to that child's safety. And the governing question is, do I think this child could end up dead? And if that's yes, then I will call child protection, right? And I'd work back from there to determine the risk.
Yeah, I think Gary puts an interesting question there in terms of the risk of overdosing, and you know that we're training workers to use Narcan, training users to have Narcan in the home, etc. But how do we manage that risk of a child potentially having a parent overdose on them or in front of them?
It's an interesting one. If it's an accidental overdose, which happens all the time, and we didn't see signs of that, then that's just unfortunately a very unlucky situation. Okay? We have clients overdose regularly that we wouldn't deem as high-risk drug users, but big one is you get a bit of fentanyl in your heroin, then you get a drop, right? So it's that accidental overdose piece that is just part of the nature of drug use and the dangers associated with it. If there is, if we think that's a risk, right, the question I would be asking is there another adult present at all times? If there's another adult present at all times that isn't a high-risk drug user, then I potentially wouldn't report that or do anything with that, because I know the child's got somewhere or got someone there that can care for them. If it's a
say something, sorry, Jackson, to interrupt. Yeah, I was referring to the person you were talking about earlier, the poly user.
Yeah,
that's on their own. So
Yeah,
would
we
you
were.
ring child protection in that circumstance?
Yeah, we did.
You
Yeah.
did, yeah.
Yeah. So that
Yeah.
child's no longer residing with their mother.
Yeah.
Yeah, because exactly that. It's a single parent scenario. If the mother drops, all right, and overdoses, the child's on their own. But the other challenge there was that basically from about 4 o'clock onwards, this person doesn't remember a thing. They don't know if they've fed their child. They don't know if they've fed themselves. They had a fire in their house about a month ago because they left the stove on and the child had to run across to someone else's house. And this child's very, very young, right? And get attention because they couldn't wake their mother up, right? So yeah, we found out about that, not at the time, but historically, but that started to paint that picture of we need to get involvement here from child protection. The question about one of the challenges, I should say, is do you tell the client that you're going to report them to child protection, right? Which comes up a lot. There's no hard and fast rule here. This is, a bit contextual, but my approach, and when I've been in those situations, is I will always tell the person, always, because if I'm making that call, I'm owning that call, and that person deserves to hear it from me, not when the police rock up with a worker to take their child, right? I would also have a conversation with them around, can I come and pick you up and we'll go in there together, right? Because sometimes that can be a lot less intrusive and scary and intense if we go into child protection at a agreed time with the child, right? Rarely do they take you up on that offer, and it's usually a bunch of swear words followed by let the cops take my child, right? But that's okay, you provide that option. But I've always, and I will always tell the parent or the guardian that I'm reporting them, unless I believe that will cause greater risk to the child.
Yeah. And
wouldn't do
child
that.
protection will ask you about that level of risk as well. And I think, once you've been through the process of making mandatory reporting, you get to have a collegiate conversation. I mean, the important thing is that Jackson's not making that decision in isolation. He's talking to other people around him. Most workers in this space, you'd be talking to a line manager who'd be making a decision. Often child protection want to hear from you, who's directly heard the disclosures. So then you're supported to have a conversation with child protection that will step you through their steps. How we go then about having conversation with the young person that we're working with or the parent in terms of notifying that process is dependent upon each case and the level of risk. But it's always ultimately coming from that foundation that we're coming from a space of minimizing the risk available, but we're making that call at a fairly high bar in terms of we're talking about significant risk here. If your sole caregiver is intoxicated, can't remember, can't care for you, that's a problem. Yeah. All right, so not that I want to finish on that note, but we're racing towards 1 o'clock. What I want to do is remind people, can everyone put their name in the chat for recording purposes? So Lee has a list of your names, so just do that in the chat today. I didn't start recording right from the very start, but I have hit record partway through. So for people watching this back, they might miss the summary, but the important thing is for people to go onto the BATForce website, look at the question for next week that Lee will run us through around service design, but in particular about how you would talk to media about service redesign processes. So it's important for you to have a go at that. If you struggle with that, reach out to your relevant organisation, whether it be your Gordon teacher, your BTACH teacher. Jackson, along with Josie, we look forward to seeing you next week as we wrap up our first SCOE chat process. But thank you to everyone that participated today, and let's end it there. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Cheers, mate. Bye.